Um, so I'll just start out by briefly describing the school where I am, and since you may not have heard of it before. So I'm in the School of Audiology and Speech Sciences, and we have graduate programs in both audiology and speech language pathology. We are the only audiology training program west of Ontario, and then there's another English program in Halifax, and then a couple of French programs. So it's a pretty small field. We take in 12 audiology students per year, and they go through a 2-year master's program after a degree in a related field like linguistics or something. They do coursework in a variety of areas, including diagnostics and management. And we have four full-time professors and a few part-time instructors. And we are in the process of hiring one more. So we are a small little school. I'd like to just share a few of the things that I do in my lab. My research and the research program that we do in my lab centers around 2 general themes and then related projects. So anything related to hearing aids, and then hearing care specifically for older adults. So the first kind of study I do is we do acoustic measures of hearing aids. And the reason we do this is hearing aids are fairly complex, nonlinear systems, and they have a lot of different processing features. And it's often hard to predict once you start putting these features together. It's often hard to predict how they're going to process real world signals of interest like speech and things like that. So these hearing aids are often put out on the market, people are wearing them, and we don't really know what they're doing to signals. So part of my research is to take these acoustic measures. And I'm showing one fairly simple study we did where we took short pure tone signals. This is what the signal looks like without a hearing aid. Presented that signal to different hearing aids and got a very surprising set of various results in the output. So each of these 3 different hearing aids process the same signal in very different ways. And then we measured the brain response, so the electrophysiological response to these signals, and found some interesting, perhaps somewhat predictable responses based on how the hearing aid had processed the signals. And I'm also interested in how hearing aids process more complex signals like speech, and then how the brain processes those signals, and then also behaviorally. So how well do people understand that speech? Do they like it? Things like that. And some of these studies can be done on a mannequin, or we can do these on real people. The next kind of study I want to highlight, here's a project that I did with an industrial partner. And it led to some nice changes in their equipment that are used for clinical hearing aid fitting. So we were doing a study of something that happens in the hearing aid fitting process, so the verification stage. So when we're fitting hearing aids, we start out by selecting a hearing aid for an individual based on a variety of factors. So things like how much hearing they have, what their listening needs are, things like their dexterity, cognition, and we choose a hearing aid. And then we go through the process of verifying that hearing aid, which is a bit of an iterative process. So we program the hearing aid, we make measures of it, and if we're not meeting targets, we go back and reprogram the hearing aid. So it's quite iterative until we reach sort of the best verification. And a couple of reasons we need to do those measures. Each hearing aid has more than 1 million combinations of settings. So there are ways to get that very right and ways to get that very wrong. So we want to make sure we measure these. And the other factor is if I were to take the same hearing aid and fit it on my ear or one of your ears, that same hearing aid would produce a different signal in different sized ears. So I like to use the analogy, if you're playing bagpipes in an open field versus a tiny closed room, the same bagpipes, the intensity is going to be different in those different spaces. And similar with our ear canals are all different sizes. And so it's going to affect the acoustics differently. So we want to make different measures. And we want to make measures of the hearing aid to make sure we account for those acoustics. So we have probe tube microphones we put in the ears to make the measurements. And then we have equipment for this purpose that gives us a nice reading that's really directed for the audiologist, so the clinician, which maybe doesn't make a lot of sense to the average patient coming in and getting hearing aids. And so the manufacturer of this particular equipment approached me to see, is this something that we can turn into something useful for patients? So can this be used as a counseling tool? Can we set it up in a way that is going to make sense and is useful, maybe as a way to increase people's understanding about their hearing aids? And so we ran focus groups. So we brought in people who had just gotten their first hearing aids and walked them through a typical verification procedure and got their feedback on what kind of made sense to them, what they wanted to know, what they didn't want to know. And then we have various ways of analyzing what happens in focus groups. And the participants had tons of suggestions. They actually did want to learn what was happening with their hearing aids at that point. Lots of information about how the information was presented, both verbally and then also visually. So I wanted to highlight here just a few of the suggested changes that our participants had in the study, and how that's impacted how the manufacturer developed their software. So this was the screen that people were looking at during the focus groups. And some of their suggestions were really basic things like make it bigger, have a screen that's client oriented. So something, maybe there's something the audiologist needs to look at for their tests. Have something that's specifically patient oriented. Add labels. The audiologist has been using this for years and know what's going on, but maybe, the patient needs a little orientation to it. And then legends as well. So these are all really great practical suggestions. We took them back to the company, and they implemented it in their software. So just to show you the changes, here's the clinician-oriented screen. And then they developed this patient-oriented screen that has nice labels on it. The legend on the side probably makes a little bit more sense than this clinician set of labels. And then there's a variety of ways to look at the data or the information about the hearing aid fitting. And all of these came directly from the results of our focus groups. So it's kind of nice to see it implemented and implemented quite quickly. Okay, the next study I wanted to briefly mention here, this is how I got involved with your group. So I was approached by some of you. I won't even start with names because I don't even know who should be acknowledged. But I was approached to help out with some acoustic measures of face masks. So we all are quite familiar with the use of face masks during COVID, and they can certainly make it harder to hear others. I think we all have that experience going into the grocery store, and there's usually a little bit of back and forth of like, what on earth are you asking me to do right now? Before you realize they're saying, how do you want to pay? So the face mask can really interfere with the acoustics, and particularly for folks who are hard of hearing, who really need the visual cues. Having the face covered is really quite destructive to their understanding of speech. So I got approached by some of you folks to help out with acoustic measures of face masks. Um, and I have a mannequin in my lab, but we needed a particular mannequin that could that had a mouth that could produce signals. And so we got creative. We got this custom head built for us that had a mouth opening, and we put a loudspeaker in there, and that allowed us to put the face mask over the loudspeaker and then make some measurements of how the masks were changing the signals that we were producing. So that was a very fun project and a quick way to get involved with some of you folks. Um, I've also done projects that are, I kind of call them more of my touchy-feely side. So looking at things like what are the barriers and facilitators for older adults seeking help for their hearing loss? And perhaps many of you have some older relatives or friends who you really wish would go for a hearing test and are just not. So there are a lot of things that can stop people from seeking help. So I've conducted focus groups, interview studies to understand that. And we've really identified some interprofessional, interdisciplinary approaches. So we're working with physicians to get physicians and nurses on board with really encouraging people to seek help. We've done some different ways of analyzing the data, focus groups. So we had some nice graphic facilitators who were capturing the thoughts and the ideas presented during focus groups as well. And I just wanted to end with a few sort of half-formed thoughts that I haven't really thought through too much, but maybe just to plant some seeds for potential collaborations. So one thing is, if any of you are doing any projects where you need to talk with older adults about anything, I and my team can be available to help out with hearing screening. So a lot of older adults do have hearing loss, and you're going to want to make sure that those folks are able to hear what's going on during the study. So if you're doing, I don't even know what you might be doing, but if that's of help to you, feel free to reach out, and we can work out some hearing screening protocols for you. I wanted to lay out some challenges that I have in my teaching. So particularly during COVID, the students have been learning a lot of their skills on mannequins. And some of the challenges are the mannequins, the skin isn't quite right for what we need to do. And we do have some challenges around finding mannequins with ears that have the right texture that's going to be like skin and not fall apart after 5 days of students yanking on the ears.
2
So
minutes
if you have
remaining.
ideas about that, was that?
2 minutes remaining.
Great, thank you. So that's one of the challenges that I'll sort of put out to you. And another sort of broad challenge in hearing aids in general is with the materials that are used in ear molds. So ear molds that are used to couple hearing aids to ears. I think there are ways to improve the materials that we have there to make them more comfortable. And also with the materials that we use to take impressions of the ears to make these custom ear molds. So those are only some like problem spaces, and I don't have specific research questions around that, but I thought I would lay them out to see if that sparks anything for any of you. And if it does, here's my email address, and feel free to reach out about that.